This video is going to take you through the basics of what you should configure to get an amazing experience out of FusionReactor. Most configurations of FusionReactor are fine out of the box, but making small changes to tailor it to your application will make all the difference so that you can maximize the benefits you can get from FusionReactor. FusionReactor uses email to send out alerts and notifications when critical situations arise, as well as sending out monitoring reports on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. So, the first thing you need to do is configure your email settings. To configure your email settings, you can go to FusionReactor on the top left and then Settings. Here, you are required to enter the to and from address as well as your email server configuration. You can then hit Send to test your settings email. In my case, I am using a Google account, but this should work with any email provider. If configured correctly, you can click Send Test Email. We'll see a green Email Sent Successfully message. FusionReactor can alert you about potential instability in your app server, and it can even take action to try and prevent server crashes and downtime. We call this capability Crash Protection. 4 types of alerting are available to warn you about things like the flooding of web requests, long-running requests, heap exhaustion, and CPU starvation. When configuring crash protection, you can use the live and archive metrics with FusionReactor to configure your first alerts. If we go to the web metrics page, we can view up to 1 hour of graphed metric, as well as aggregate data for the uptime of the application server. In the overview, we can see our average request time is 1020 milliseconds. And you can see we have a spike in request time of 5 to 10 seconds occurring. To configure a crash protection alert for this, simply go to Protection, then Settings, and then Runtime Protection. Here, we set the threshold, in my case of 5 seconds, and select Email Alert when a long request triggers. You can set this threshold higher or lower as required, so you can get all the valuable information you need without being flooded with alerts. We can then navigate to the email settings and ensure that notification emails are enabled, and configure the timeout to prevent email flooding. We will now receive an email if a request longer than 5 seconds occurs, and this email should indicate why the request took so long. FusionReactor is great for highlighting potential performance problems. It can provide insight into transaction performance and database query performance, as well as profile your code as it's executing in production to measure how much time is being spent with individual methods. You can configure thresholds for what is considered a slow web request, transaction, or JDBC request to fit your application and performance goals. The default for slow requests is 8 seconds. Using metrics, you can determine how long your request takes on average, and then use this information to set meaningful thresholds. You can change the time for what is considered a slow request in the settings pages in the Requests or JDBC menu. We know in our case that the average runtime of a request is 1000 milliseconds, so we will set the threshold to 2 seconds. If you go to Requests, Settings, then Web Request History or Transaction History tab, you can define the slow request threshold and can do the same in the JDBC settings under the History tab. If you've got FusionReactor Ultimate or are running the trial version of FusionReactor, you have access to the Code Profiler, which will continuously profile your code and identify performance bottlenecks. To make the most of the profiler, you can also configure at which point transactions will begin profiling to find out where your slow requests are taking the time. Under the profiler settings, you can configure the minimum transaction threshold. We find that profiles with more than 5 samples or 1 second of time provide valuable data. If the majority of the requests are under 2 seconds, then setting the threshold to 2 seconds will provide value for any request running over 3 or 4 seconds. FusionReactor will by default log every web request and all metrics from FusionReactor for 31 days. These logs can be viewed within the log archive, where they are displayed in a graphical manner, similar to the live data in FusionReactor, allowing you to diagnose issues post-crash. In order to track JDBC and transactions in the logs, we need to enable the logging for these requests. With these logs, you will see database requests and any other tracked requests such as CF tags or HTTP requests. To enable JDBC logging, go to JDBC Settings, Loggings and Metrics, and then Enable Logging. Then set a time threshold for logging to ensure that log files contain only useful debug data. To configure the transaction logging, go to FusionReactor on the top left, then Plugins, then Active Plugins. On this page, find the Transaction Logger plugin and click Configure. Here, you can enable logging for a minimum threshold and also limit what transactions are logged. For example, you may only want to log CF HTTP or HTTP client requests. The final thing to look at is enabling additional transaction metrics to help diagnose issues as they occur. In order to limit the memory used by FusionReactor, we truncate the length of tracked JDBC statements. If you have complex queries, this can mean your JDBC statements will be cut short and you cannot see the full query for tracking down issues. You can tune the truncation of statements by going to JDBC settings by either disabling SQL text, limiting or increasing the character limit. In the Settings page, you can also enable the Query Plan, which will generate an execution plan for that is slow. This gives you the option to see why a query was slow without having to rerun the query yourself. Another action to consider is enabling user agent logging by going to Request Settings, then Request Logging. This will allow you to see whether your application is being spammed or crawled by bots causing performance degradations within the request logs. This gives you a great starting point for gaining insight into your applications. You will now receive summarized performance reports, alerts for potential issues, and have the details available to diagnose issues both live and in a post-crash scenario.